And I'd like to begin this morning by thanking you for your leadership and for working with me so closely on fiscal year 2020 appropriations bill. Very proud of the work we accomplished to fund many of the programs we'll discuss this morning. Also like to welcome Secretary Bernhardt to the subcommittee. Good to have you here today. Mr. Secretary, I know you are here to discuss the administration's fiscal 2021 budget request, but I also want to thank you for visiting with me this week and taking time to sit down with the leaders of this subcommittee from both chambers to talk about the relocation of the Bureau of Land Management. Now, it's no secret that I oppose the move, and I still have questions and concerns about whether the move will actually improve the agency's effectiveness. But the reorganization is moving forward, and I'm going to do what I can to support the Bureau employees during this process. One thing I do support is investing more resources on the ground in western states, so I was glad to hear that you still intend to add more positions on the ground in New Mexico to address energy and land management needs. I was also very glad to hear that you do not intend to follow through on the threat that one of your subordinates made last year to pull resources out of my state simply because we had a policy disagreement. I appreciate that commitment very much, and so thank you very much for that. And I want to work with you and with members of the subcommittee to ensure that the BLM has the resources and the people it needs to take care of its public lands and to serve the public. Returning to the budget requests, I will say up front that I don't plan to focus too much time on the details this morning. As you know, as the chairman has said, President proposes, Congress disposes. And I expect that we will restore many of these cuts in a bipartisan way. There's no way this subcommittee will agree to cut the Land and Water Conservation Fund by 97% or reduce payments in lieu of taxes or cut operating funds for national parks. But this budget is a very accurate portrayal of the administration's priorities. From my perspective, when I look across the landscape, here's what I see. In 3 years, this administration has actively worked to dismantle 50 years' worth of protections from bedrock environmental laws, decimated Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante national monuments, ignoring the voices of Native communities, weakened protections for endangered species and dismantled migratory bird protections, put an anti-public land zealot in charge of managing public lands, adopted a drill-at-all-costs approach for managing our public lands, and abandoned any and all efforts to fight climate change. These policy choices are wrong for the environment and wrong for the people of our nation. Simply put, the President's vision is moving us backward at a time when we can least afford it. When the need for us to tackle crises like climate and mass extinction have never been more urgent. Humans are destroying nature at a devastating rate. In the United States, we are losing a football field of natural area every 30 seconds. Our wetlands, forests, and coasts are being destroyed. States have identified more than 12,000 wildlife species that need better protection. Climate change is threatening every corner of our Earth. Worldwide, 1 million species risk extinction in the coming decades. That's why I've called for protecting and restoring 30% of the nation's lands and waters by 2030. My 30 by 30 to Save Nature resolution calls for saving enough of our ecosystems before it's too late, and Congress needs to do more right now to permanently fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Sounds like the President now agrees. We talked about this momentarily before we came in, and that stands there and is very good news, I think, for all of us. We need to give state, tribal, and local governments tools to address these issues at their level, and we need to invest in science programs and then actually listen to what the scientists tell us. Our country also needs to face down climate change as the existential threat to humanity that it is. We must address the fact that emissions from fossil fuels extracted on public lands account for nearly 1/4 of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, the Trump administration ripped up the 2016 rules to limit methane pollution. And we must protect environmentally and culturally sensitive public lands from development, like the legislation I've introduced to protect Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. Developed in partnership with New Mexico tribes who consider this area sacred. As we transition away from fossil fuels, we must also support and protect communities, tribes, and states that have relied on fossil fuels in the process. Transitioning to a clean energy economy is for everyone, and no one can be left out. Finally, we need to undertake all these actions with equity and inclusion as our North Star. We can't ignore the legacy of toxic pollution that has harmed so many low-income communities and communities of color. In particular, we cannot ignore the centuries of desecration of Native American sacred sites and cultural resources. I wish I could say that these practices are in the past, but our government literally and tragically desecrated human remains by blasting holes in burial grounds and other culturally significant sites to construct the president's foolish border wall near the Tono Otham Nation in Arizona. Injustices like these must not be allowed to continue and must be addressed through sound policy and out of respect for the federal trust responsibility and the bedrock principle of federal Indian law that have anchored the government-to-government relationship for more than a century. We also need to give tribes the resources they need to protect and conserve their lands and build strong economies for their communities, not slash funding from their programs as this budget request proposes to do. So we have a lot to talk about. So I look forward to hearing from you, Secretary Bernhardt, and I hope myself and all the members have an opportunity to ask a number of questions here this morning. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.